A cold mist hangs low over a narrow dirt road, somewhere in early 18th century Europe, where the morning light struggles to break through the weight of damp air and smoke from distant hearth fires. A cart creaks forward, its wooden wheels sinking slightly into the uneven ground, pulled by a horse that moves with patient exhaustion rather than strength. Every few miles, the rhythm of progress is interrupted by mud, broken axle paths, or the simple fact that the road itself refuses to cooperate with human intention. In this world, movement is never guaranteed. It is negotiated with terrain, weather, and the limits of muscle and endurance. Before the first railways emerge, human civilization already stretches across continents, but it does so in a fragmented way, stitched together by fragile arteries of travel that are slow, expensive, and often dangerous. Goods move only as fast as animals can pull them. People travel only as far as necessity demands. Entire economies are shaped by this constraint, and cities rise or stagnate depending on their access to navigable rivers or reliable coastal routes. Overland travel, especially across inland regions, remains one of the most inefficient systems ever sustained by advanced societies. Before going deeper into how this changes, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because what unfolds in the coming story is not just the invention of a machine, but the collapse of an old way of understanding distance itself. In these centuries before railroads, canals represent the most advanced form of bulk transport. In England, France, and parts of the Netherlands, carefully engineered waterways allow barges to carry coal, grain, and stone with far greater efficiency than any cart could manage. Yet canals are slow, geographically limited, and dependent on elevation and water supply. A single frozen winter can bring entire regional economies to a halt. A drought can silence trade routes for months. Even at their best, canals bind movement to the natural landscape in ways that cannot be escaped. On land, the situation is even more restrictive. Roads are often little more than hardened tracks, eroded by weather and repeatedly reshaped by traffic. Heavy wagons damage them quickly, forcing constant maintenance that many regions cannot afford. In rural areas, seasonal mud can render entire regions nearly inaccessible. The idea of consistent, scheduled long-distance travel simply does not exist in any modern sense. Every journey is an event, planned carefully, executed slowly, and endured rather than enjoyed. Yet within this constrained world, pressure builds quietly. Population growth in parts of Europe increases demand for coal, iron, textiles, and raw materials. Mines deepen. Factories begin to emerge in early industrial centres, especially in Britain. The distance between production sites and markets grows more important, and yet the tools for bridging that distance remain primitive. Something fundamental begins to strain against its own limits. One of the most overlooked truths of this era is that transportation is not just a convenience. It is the invisible framework that determines what kind of civilization is possible. When movement is slow, knowledge spreads slowly. When transport is unreliable, markets remain local. When distance is expensive, innovation is constrained by geography. Even military power is shaped by how far an army can march before it exhausts its supplies. Entire empires have risen and fallen based on these logistical boundaries. In this fragile system, small innovations matter enormously. Improvements in road surfacing, better horse harnesses, and more efficient wagons all create incremental gains. But none of them break the underlying limitation. Land travel still depends on animal strength and human endurance. The idea that a machine could replace muscle entirely exists only in the realm of speculation, early scientific curiosity, and mechanical experimentation. At the same time, a quieter transformation is unfolding underground. In the coal mines of England and parts of continental Europe, miners begin laying wooden planks and later iron-reinforced tracks to move heavy carts more easily. These early wagonways are not designed for speed or passengers. They are purely functional solutions to a local problem how to move heavy loads of stone and coal with less friction. Yet in their simplicity lies a hidden breakthrough. For the first time, movement is guided by a fixed path designed for efficiency rather than terrain. These wagonways do not yet resemble railways in the modern sense. They are crude, often uneven, and limited to mining environments, but they introduce a critical idea that rolling motion can be controlled, directed, and optimized in ways that open entirely new possibilities for transport. The wheels no longer have to fight the ground, they follow it. Outside the mines, however, most of the world remains unaware that such systems even exist. For the average traveller, the world is still defined by the unpredictability of roads, the rhythm of horses, and the endurance required to cross even modest distances. A journey of 50 kilometres can take an entire day. A journey across a country can take weeks. Communication between cities is measured in days or months, not minutes or hours. This separation between emerging industrial innovation and everyday reality creates a quiet tension. On one side, early engineers and inventors begin to imagine systems that could radically change transport. On the other, society at large continues to function within the constraints of older technologies. The gap between what is possible in principle and what is practical in reality begins to widen. It is within this gap that the first true transformation of a rail-based transport will eventually emerge. But at this stage, nothing suggests revolution. Only small improvements, isolated experiments, and incremental engineering solutions hint that something larger may be forming beneath the surface of everyday life. The world is still built on horses, canals, and roads that bend to geography rather than overcoming it. Yet beneath this familiar surface, the logic of movement itself is beginning to shift. Not suddenly, but gradually, as if the landscape of human travel is preparing for a structure it has not yet fully revealed. Deep inside the damp tunnels of early European mines, where sunlight never reaches and the air carries the metallic scent of stone dust and sweat, a different kind of movement begins to take shape. Wooden rails, roughly cut and unevenly spaced, line narrow passageways carved into the earth. Small carts, heavy with coal or ore, roll along these paths with far less resistance than if they were dragged directly across the ground. The sound they make is distinct, a steady wooden rhythm. Controlled and repetitive, almost like a primitive heartbeat of industry hidden underground. These early wagonways emerged not as inventions of visionaries seeking to change the world, but as practical responses to physical limits. Mines grow deeper, and hauling material by hand becomes inefficient and dangerous. Horses struggle in confined tunnels where an uneven ground slows every attempt at extraction. By guiding wheels along fixed wooden paths, miners discover something unexpectedly powerful. The act of movement can be simplified, reduced to a controlled interaction between wheel and track rather than a constant negotiation with terrain. At first, these systems are inconsistent. Some mines use wooden planks, others use rough stone guides or grooves carved into the earth. The carts themselves are simple, often little more than reinforced boxes mounted on basic wheels. Yet even in this crude form, the principle proves effective enough to spread across mining regions in England, Germany, and parts of France. Each adaptation improves durability, reduces friction, or increases load capacity, slowly refining the concept without any single moment of invention. What makes this development so important is not its scale, but its implication. For thousands of years, wheeled transport has always adapted to terrain. Roads are flexible, changing with weather and use. But here, for the first time, the path itself is fixed, and the wheel is made to conform to it. This reversal of relationship seems small, but it quietly marks the beginning of a fundamental shift in how humans think about movement. Outside the mines, life continues in familiar patterns. Horses still dominate overland transport. Carriages carry passengers across rough roads that demand constant repair. Merchants still rely on seasonal timing to move goods safely between markets. Nothing about society at large suggests that these underground experiments will soon reshape civilization. And yet, within industrial centres, demand for more efficient extraction grows steadily. Coal becomes more valuable as early furnaces, forges, and proto-factories begin to rely on it as a primary energy source. As production increases, so does the pressure on transportation systems. Moving heavy materials over land remains costly and slow. Even short distances between mines and rivers or ports require significant labour. It is within this logistical strain that wagonways begin to evolve. Wooden rails are reinforced with iron strips to reduce wear. Wheels are reshaped to fit more securely along tracks. The simple act of rolling becomes more efficient, more predictable, and more scalable. One overlooked detail in this period is how localised these innovations remain. There is no unified system, no shared standard. Each mine, each estate, each industrial site develops its own version of track design. Some use flat wooden beams, others carved grooves, and others early iron plating. This fragmentation prevents immediate large-scale transformation, but it also allows experimentation without constraint. Different regions unknowingly test variations of a technology that has not yet been recognised as revolutionary. Meanwhile, scientific thought in Europe is slowly changing how engineers understand motion, force, and mechanics. The work of early physicists and mathematicians begins to formalise concepts that were previously intuitive. Friction, gravity, and momentum are no longer just observed phenomena but measurable forces. This intellectual shift matters deeply because it allows mechanical systems to be designed with intention rather than trial and error alone. Within this intellectual environment, the idea of applying controlled power to transportation begins to emerge, not yet in practical form, but as speculation. Water wheels already harness natural energy for milling grain. Windmills capture atmospheric force. The question begins to form quietly: if nature can be harnessed for stationary work, could it also be used for movement itself? At the same time, the limitations of animal-based transport become more visible. Horses require feed, rest, and care. Their capacity is finite, and their performance declines under heavy industrial demand. Roads remain inconsistent, and weather continues to dictate reliability. Even the best improvements in carriage design cannot overcome the fundamental dependency on living muscle. The system remains fundamentally biological, and therefore inherently constrained. The contrast between underground wagonways and surface transport becomes increasingly important. Below ground, movement is becoming mechanical in principle, even if still human or animal-powered in execution. Above ground, transport remains organic, irregular, and dependent on environmental conditions. This duality creates a quiet divergence in technological evolution, one path moving toward controlled systems, the other remaining tied to traditional forms. In mining regions, the efficiency gains from wagonways are impossible to ignore. More coal can be extracted and transported with less effort. This increase in productivity feeds directly into early industrial growth, reinforcing demand for even more efficient systems. Yet even as these improvements accumulate, they remain confined to specific environments. The idea of extending such systems across open landscapes, connecting cities or regions, still seems impractical given the technological limits of the time. Still, A conceptual threshold has been crossed. The wheel is no longer just an adaptation to roads, it is becoming part of a guided system. Movement is beginning to shift from improvisation to design, and once that shift begins, even in isolated environments, it becomes difficult to reverse. What remains absent at this stage is the force that will unlock the full potential of this idea. The wagonways of the mining world can reduce friction, but they cannot create motion. They depend entirely on external power, whether human or animal. The missing element is energy-controlled, scalable, and independent of muscle. That absence is not yet recognized as the central problem, but it is precisely what will drive the next transformation, as engineers begin to search not just for better paths, but for a way to make movement itself self-sustaining. In the still workshops of early industrial Britain, where iron tools hang from wooden beams blackened by soot and coal smoke, a different kind of problem begins to dominate the minds of inventors and engineers. It is not the question of how to move heavy loads more efficiently along fixed tracks, but how to create motion without relying on animals, rivers, or wind. Something must generate force on demand, something repeatable, controllable, and powerful enough to shift the weight of industry itself. At this point in history, steam is already known, but not yet understood as a universal source of mechanical power. It is seen as a curious byproduct of boiling water, capable of producing pressure, sometimes even violent force, but difficult to control and harness safely. Early steam engines exist, but they are stationary, massive, and limited in purpose. They pump water out of mines, nothing more. Yet even in this narrow role, they hint at a larger possibility. The heat could be transformed into motion. The early steam engines developed by inventors like Thomas Newcomen are slow and inefficient by modern standards, consuming vast quantities of coal to perform relatively simple tasks. But in the context of deepening mines, their value is undeniable. Water flooding underground shafts is a constant threat, and manual removal is impossible at scale. The steam engine solves a specific problem, and in doing so, it establishes a new relationship between energy and labour. For the first time, human effort is not the only source of mechanical work. What is not immediately obvious to many observers of the time is that these engines are not limited by their function, but by their design. They are stationary not because steam cannot move, but because no one has yet fully reimagined how it might be contained, directed, and applied in mobile systems. The concept of a self-moving machine remains theoretical, constrained by engineering limitations and the absence of precise mechanical control systems. Within scientific circles, however, understanding of thermodynamics and mechanical principles begins to deepen. Heat is increasingly recognized not just as a substance or effect, but as a form of energy that can be converted into motion. This shift in understanding is subtle but profound. It opens the possibility that energy might be decoupled from biological or environmental sources entirely. In parallel, improvements in metallurgy allow for stronger, more heat-resistant materials. Iron production becomes more consistent, and early steelmaking techniques begin to emerge. These developments matter because steam engines require containment systems that can withstand pressure without failing. Every incremental improvement in material science brings the idea of controlled steam power closer to practical reality. Still, for much of society, these changes remain invisible. The average person continues to experience transportation as something external to machinery. Movement is still tied to horses, carts, ships, and canals. The idea that a machine might one day carry people across land without living power seems distant, almost speculative. Yet in the workshops of inventors, experimentation intensifies. Engineers begin modifying steam engines, attempting to reduce size, increase efficiency, and redirect motion into rotating systems rather than simple pumping actions. This shift is crucial. A pumping engine moves only in one direction, performing repetitive vertical work. A rotating engine, however, can be adapted to drive wheels, gears, and eventually, entire vehicles. Among these early innovators, figures such as James Watt play a pivotal role in refining steam technology. His improvements to efficiency, condensation, and power control dramatically reduce fuel consumption and increase reliability. More importantly, his work demonstrates that steam engines can be refined into systems capable of sustained, predictable motion rather than sporadic bursts of force. As these innovations accumulate, a conceptual bridge begins to form between stationary engines and mobile transport systems. Engineers start to imagine what it would mean to place a steam engine on a wheeled platform. At first, the idea seems impractical. Engines are heavy, fragile, and dependent on stable foundations. But the principle is no longer purely theoretical. The physics now suggest possibility. At the same time, the wagonways developed in mines continue to evolve. Iron rails replace wood in many locations, significantly reducing wear and increasing load capacity. Wheels are reshaped to match rail geometry more precisely, improving stability. These improvements may seem incremental, but they are quietly preparing the ground for a fusion of two previously separate technologies, steam power and guided rail movement. The key realization emerging across different engineering disciplines is that movement can be separated into three components: power generation, motion control, and directional guidance. Steam engines begin to address power generation. Wagonways provide directional guidance. What remains unresolved is integration. It is important to understand that no single inventor fully sees the entire system at once. Instead, progress occurs through fragmented discoveries. each solving a narrow problem while unintentionally contributing to a larger structure. In mining regions, engineers focus on transport efficiency. In industrial workshops, inventors focus on energy conversion. In scientific institutions, researchers refine the understanding of motion and force. These separate threads are not yet recognized as parts of a unified transformation. The world at this stage is still dominated by uncertainty about scale. Machines are large, expensive, and experimental. Investment is risky. Failures are common. Many early steam experiments end in mechanical breakdowns or inefficient designs that are abandoned, yet even failures contribute to knowledge, revealing constraints that must be overcome. What is slowly emerging is not just a new machine, but a new philosophy of movement. Instead of adapting to the environment, engineers begin to imagine systems that reshape the environment itself. Instead of relying on living power, they begin to design systems that generate their own force. Instead of accepting distance as a fixed limitation, they begin to consider it something that can be compressed through technology. At this stage, railways as we understand them do not yet exist, but all necessary components are beginning to align. Iron tracks, steam power, mechanical control systems, and industrial demand are converging in a way that makes a larger breakthrough increasingly inevitable. What remains missing is the moment when these separate strands are finally brought together into a single working system that can move not just materials in mines, but entire loads across open landscapes. That moment is approaching, not as a sudden leap, but as the gradual convergence of ideas that have been building for decades beneath the surface of industrial life. A short distance outside the industrial towns of early 19th century England, where smoke from coal fires hangs permanently in the air like a second sky, a new kind of experiment begins to move slowly along narrow iron tracks. It is not yet a railway in the modern sense, but something closer to a prototype of possibility, a fragile demonstration that heavy machines can move themselves without horses, without canals, and without the old rhythms of muscle and weather. The air around these experiments is filled with uncertainty, not because the physics are unknown, but because the consequences are still unimaginable. In this period, the idea of a self-propelled vehicle is still treated with caution. Steam engines are large, expensive, and often unpredictable. They are known to explode when pressure builds incorrectly, or fail when seals and valves cannot maintain consistency. Yet engineers continue to refine them, driven by the simple pressure of necessity. Mines demand better transport, factories demand faster supply, cities demand more coal, more iron, more everything than traditional systems can provide. The earliest experimental locomotives are built with the mindset of adaptation rather than invention. Engineers take existing steam engines and attempt to mount them on wheeled platforms, connecting pistons to axles in ways that convert vertical or linear motion into rotation. This is not an elegant process. It is mechanical compromise, a series of adjustments made to force one technology into the constraints of another. And yet, despite their crude nature, these early machines begin to move. One of the most important realizations during this period is that friction, once seen as a limitation, becomes a controllable factor when wheels run on iron rails. The smoother the surface, the less energy is wasted. Wagonways, originally designed for mining carts, suddenly reveal a much larger potential. If steam can generate continuous motion, and iron rails can guide that motion efficiently, then distance itself becomes something that can be traversed at unprecedented speed. In workshops scattered across Britain, engineers experiment with different configurations. Some locomotives struggle with traction, their wheels spinning uselessly on smooth rails. Others are too heavy, breaking the very tracks meant to support them. Fuel consumption remains high, and reliability is inconsistent, but each failure refines understanding. Each adjustment brings the concept closer to stability. It is in this environment that early designs like those developed by George Stephenson and his contemporaries begin to stand out. Unlike earlier experimental engines, these locomotives are designed with a clearer focus on balance between power, weight, and rail compatibility. They are not merely machines attached to wheels, they are systems designed from the ground up to operate on tracks. This subtle difference marks a turning point in engineering thinking. One of the lesser-known but crucial details of this period is the resistance these innovations face from established transport industries. Canals and horse-drawn freight systems dominate regional economies, and investment in rail-based steam transport is seen as risky. Many observers doubt that iron tracks can replace the flexibility of roads or waterways. Others worry about safety, noise, and the unfamiliar speed of mechanical travel. Progress, at this stage, is not only technical but also social resistance management. Despite skepticism, small rail lines begin to prove their worth in specific contexts. Short industrial routes between mines, factories, and ports show dramatic improvements in efficiency. Loads that once required multiple horses and hours of travel can now be moved more quickly and with fewer resources. These successes are not immediately revolutionary, but they accumulate like pressure building beneath a surface that is not yet cracked. As experiments continue, attention shifts to standardization. Track width, wheel design, and engine configuration all vary widely in early systems, creating incompatibility between different rail networks. Engineers begin to realize that for rail transport to expand beyond isolated industrial applications, it must become unified. A shared system of measurement and design is necessary, even if no formal standard yet exists. The most famous demonstration of this emerging technology occurs in early public trials, where locomotives are tested not just in industrial settings, but in more visible, commercially oriented environments. These trials reveal both the promise and limitations of the technology. When conditions are favourable, locomotives outperform every existing land transport system. When conditions are poor, they struggle with mechanical failures, derailments, and inefficiency. The technology is powerful, but not yet stable. One of the most striking aspects of these early demonstrations is how quickly public perception begins to shift. What was once dismissed as experimental machinery begins to appear as a glimpse of a different future. Speed, in particular, becomes a defining factor. Even modest improvements over horse-drawn travel feel transformative. The idea that a journey of hours could replace one of days begins to alter expectations about distance itself. At the same time, infrastructure becomes a hidden but essential component of success. Iron rails must be precisely laid, gradients must be carefully managed, curves must be engineered to prevent derailment at increasing speeds. Railways are not simply machines, they are systems that reshape landscapes. Hills are cut through, valleys bridged, and terrain modified to accommodate controlled motion. This interaction between machine and environment introduces a new kind of engineering philosophy. Instead of adapting movement to nature, nature is increasingly adapted to movement. The ground itself becomes part of the system. Earth is no longer a passive surface but an engineered component of transportation. Yet even as these systems improve, uncertainty remains. Safety is not guaranteed. Mechanical failure can be catastrophic. Early locomotives operate without the redundancy or control systems that modern engineering would require. Every journey carries risk, and every improvement is tested against real-world consequences. What emerges from this experimental period is not a finished technology, but a proof of concept that cannot be ignored. Steam locomotion on iron rails works, not perfectly, but convincingly enough to justify further investment. The idea of rail transport shifts from curiosity to infrastructure and development. The world is still far from fully transformed. Horses continue to dominate many routes. Canals remain essential for bulk transport. Roads still define most travel experiences. But beneath this coexistence, a new system has begun to assert itself, one that will gradually expand beyond its experimental origins and begin reshaping entire nations. The age of railways has not yet fully arrived, but it is no longer a question of if it will, only how quickly the rest of the world will adapt to a form of movement that no longer depends on muscle, weather, or the limits of traditional geography. On a windswept morning in northern England, a thin line of iron track cuts across fields that have been shaped by centuries of farming, grazing, and slow human settlement. It looks unremarkable at first glance, almost fragile against the vastness of the landscape. Yet along this line, something unprecedented begins to gather momentum. A steam locomotive, still raw in its design, and heavy with the smell of coal and oil, prepares to move not just cargo, but the idea of distance itself. By this stage in the early 19th century, the rivalry between locomotive designs has become intense, though not yet fully organised into the kind of industrial competition that will later define railway history. Engineers are no longer asking whether steam can move vehicles along rails. That question has already been answered through repeated imperfect demonstrations. The real question now is how fast, how reliably, and how safely such systems can operate at scale. Among the most significant breakthroughs of this period is the refinement of traction and wheel design. Early locomotives often struggled with slipping wheels, especially under heavy load or wet conditions. Engineers begin to understand that weight distribution and wheel-rail interaction are not secondary concerns, but core principles that determine whether a machine can function at all. Subtle adjustments to wheel flanges, rail smoothness, and engine weight balance begin to transform unreliable prototypes into functional transport systems. One of the most famous machines associated with this era is the rocket, designed by George Stephenson and his collaborators. While not the very first locomotive, it represents a convergence point where multiple engineering improvements come together in a more coherent and efficient design. Its performance in early trials demonstrates that steam locomotion is not only possible, but potentially superior to all existing land-based transport methods when conditions are controlled. What makes this moment important is not just the machine itself, but the standards it begins to suggest. Competing designs from other engineers show different approaches to boiler construction, steam expansion, and mechanical linkage. Some prioritize power, others efficiency, others durability. Through trial, failure, and comparison, certain design principles begin to dominate. Boiler pressure becomes more carefully managed. Exhaust systems are refined to improve airflow and combustion. Mechanical energy transfer is optimized to reduce loss. Yet even as locomotives improve, they remain part of a larger system that is still in its infancy. Railways are not just machines, they are coordinated infrastructures requiring precise engineering across miles of terrain. Track alignment, gradient control, and structural support become as important as locomotive design itself. A powerful engine is useless if the track cannot sustain it. This interdependence forces engineers to think in systems rather than isolated inventions. At the same time, early railway companies begin to form. These are not yet global corporations, but localized enterprises driven by investors, industrialists, and engineers who recognize the economic potential of faster transport. The construction of rail lines requires enormous capital investment, often supported by speculation and long-term projections of industrial growth. Entire regions begin to reorganize their economic expectations around the presence of rail access. One of the lesser-known aspects of this period is how quickly railways begin to reshape labor itself. Construction of tracks requires vast numbers of workers, often operating under difficult and dangerous conditions. Earth must be excavated, embankments built, tunnels carved through rock, and bridges constructed across rivers and valleys. The physical scale of this transformation is unprecedented, and it creates a new class of industrial labourers whose work is tied directly to the expansion of mechanical mobility. As railways expand, they also begin to redefine time and coordination. Train schedules introduce a level of precision that earlier transport systems never required. Before railways, local time variations between towns had little practical consequence. With trains operating on fixed timetables, however, synchronization becomes essential. Time itself begins to standardize, slowly but irreversibly, around the logic of mechanical movement. Public reaction to these developments is complex. For some, railways represent progress, efficiency, and the promise of economic expansion. For others, they are disruptive forces that alter familiar landscapes and threaten established livelihoods. Horse-drawn transport workers, canal operators, and local traders often view rail expansion with concern, recognizing that their traditional roles are becoming less central to the movement of goods and people. Yet despite resistance, the advantages of rail transport become increasingly difficult to ignore. Speed increases dramatically compared to road or canal systems. Large volumes of goods can be moved consistently, regardless of weather conditions that would previously halt transport entirely. Markets expand beyond local boundaries, and cities begin to experience new levels of economic integration. An important but often overlooked consequence of this transformation is the psychological shift in how distance is perceived. Journeys that once defined entire days or weeks of effort begin to contract into hours. Regions that once felt remote become accessible within a single day's travel. This compression of space alters expectations about trade, communication, and even personal mobility. At the technical level, continuous refinement continues. Engineers experiment with multi-tube boilers, improved valve systems, and more efficient fuel combustion. Rail tracks become heavier and more durable, capable of supporting increasing locomotive weight and speed. The system begins to stabilize, moving from experimental inconsistency toward industrial reliability. Still, early railways are far from perfected systems. Accidents occur, mechanical failures remain common, and infrastructure is constantly under strain. But what distinguishes this era is not perfection, but momentum. Each failure produces data. Each improvement becomes a foundation for further expansion. The system evolves not in leaps, but in accumulating layers of refinement. By the end of this period, railways are no longer isolated experiments or industrial curiosities. They are becoming networks, slowly connecting towns, cities, and industrial centres into a more unified system of movement. Steam, iron, and engineered land begin to merge into a new kind of geography, one defined not only by natural features but by constructed pathways of speed and efficiency. The world has not yet fully adjusted to what this means, but the direction is now clear. Movement is no longer bound primarily by biology or terrain. It is becoming mechanical, scalable, and increasingly independent of the limitations that once defined human travel. By the time iron rails begin to stretch beyond isolated industrial corridors and into broader regional networks, the landscape itself starts to feel subtly rewritten. Fields that once defined rural stillness are now intersected by straight, engineered lines that ignore natural contours in favour of calculated gradients. Small towns that once depended on river routes or rough roads suddenly find themselves connected to something faster, louder, and far more consistent than anything that came before it. The railway is no longer an experiment, it is becoming a structural force. The expansion of rail networks in Britain during this period is driven by a combination of industrial necessity and financial ambition. Coal mines in the north demand reliable transport to factories and ports. Textile centres require steady supply chains for raw materials and distribution of finished goods. Ironworks depend on rapid movement of heavy cargo that would be impractical by road. Railways solve all of these problems at once, and in doing so, they reshape the economic geography of the entire region. One of the most significant changes is the collapse of distance as a limiting factor in industrial planning. Before railways, factories had to be located near water sources or raw material deposits to remain efficient. With rail transport, production and consumption can be separated by far greater distances. This allows industry to concentrate in specialised hubs, creating early forms of industrial clustering that will later define modern economic systems. At the same time, the railway system begins to influence the growth of cities themselves. Urban centres located along major rail lines expand rapidly, drawing in workers, merchants, and capital. Stations become new focal points of activity, often more important than traditional marketplaces or river ports. Around these stations, entire districts emerge, shaped by the rhythm of arrivals and departures. The city is no longer organised solely around geography, but around schedules. A less visible but equally important transformation occurs in supply chains. Goods that once required long, uncertain journeys now move with predictable timing. Perishable items, manufactured goods, and raw materials can be coordinated across distances that previously made synchronization impossible. This reliability begins to change how businesses operate, encouraging larger-scale production and more complex distribution networks. Yet this rapid expansion is not without tension. The construction of railways cuts through existing land ownership patterns, disrupting farms, estates, and local communities. Land acquisition often involves legal disputes, compensation negotiations, and in some cases forced restructuring of rural landscapes. The railway does not simply pass through territory, it reorganises it. Engineering challenges also intensify as networks expand. Early rail lines were relatively short and manageable, but as systems grow, they must contend with increasingly complex terrain. Rivers require bridges of unprecedented scale. Hills demand cuttings or tunnels that require advanced engineering techniques. Soil stability, weather exposure, and long-term maintenance become constant concerns. The railway is no longer just a machine system. It's a continuous engineering project spanning entire nations. One of the more subtle but profound effects of this expansion is the standardization of industrial time. As rail networks grow, scheduling becomes essential. Trains must depart and arrive according to coordinated timetables to avoid conflict on shared tracks. This requirement forces regions that once operated on local solar time to gradually align with standardized time zones. The experience of time itself begins to shift from local variation to national synchronization. Public perception of railways continues to evolve during this phase. What was once viewed with suspicion or novelty becomes increasingly normalized. The sound of steam locomotives, once startling and unfamiliar, becomes part of the ambient environment of industrial life. Yet fascination remains. Trains represent speed, power, and modernity in a way few other technologies do at this time. They are both practical infrastructure and symbolic of a new industrial age. Economically, railways also begin to reshape investment patterns. Large-scale capital is required to build tracks, stations, and rolling stock, leading to the rise of joint stock railway companies. Investors speculate not only on existing demand but on future expansion, sometimes driving rapid growth beyond immediate practical need. This introduces cycles of boom and uncertainty, where railway expansion can accelerate quickly and then stabilize as markets adjust. Despite these fluctuations, the long-term trend is unmistakable. Rail transport is proving to be more efficient, more reliable, and more scalable than any previous land-based system. The speed of goods movement increases dramatically, but perhaps more importantly, the consistency of that movement transforms how entire economies function. Uncertainty, once a defining feature of transport, begins to recede. In rural areas, however, the impact is more complex. Some communities benefit from increased access to markets and resources. Others experience disruption as traditional routes and economic structures are bypassed. The railway does not distribute its effects evenly. It creates new centres of activity while diminishing the importance of others, reshaping regional hierarchies in the process. Technological refinement continues alongside expansion. Locomotives become more powerful and efficient. Track design improves to support heavier loads and higher speeds. Signalling systems begin to emerge, allowing for safer coordination of multiple trains on shared lines. Each of these improvements reduces friction in the system, making rail transport more reliable and predictable. What is emerging by this point is not just a transportation network, but a new kind of spatial organisation. Geography is no longer defined solely by physical distance or natural barriers. It is increasingly defined by connectivity. Two places separated by hundreds of kilometres but linked by rail can now be functionally closer than neighbouring regions without access to the network. This redefinition of space has long-term consequences that extend far beyond transportation. It influences commerce, communication, migration, and even political organisation. The railway becomes a framework through which modern industrial society begins to organise itself, not just physically but structurally. By the end of this phase, the railway is no longer a novelty or an innovation in progress. It has become an essential infrastructure, deeply embedded in the functioning of industrial civilization. Its expansion continues, but its role is already established, and the world has begun to adjust to a new reality in which movement is no longer constrained primarily by the limitations of the past, but increasingly shaped by engineered systems of speed and coordination. Beneath the expanding lattice of iron rails and steaming locomotives, another reality unfolds that is far less visible than the promise of speed and industrial progress. It is a world of mud, sweat, financial risk, and human cost, where the construction of railways demands not only engineering skill but immense physical sacrifice. Long before trains carry passengers at remarkable speeds across countries, thousands of workers reshape entire landscapes with hand tools, explosives, and sheer endurance. The expansion of early rail networks is not a clean or orderly process. It is messy, uneven, and often brutal. Tracks must cut through hills that resist removal, traverse wetlands that swallow foundations, and cross rivers that require bridges of unprecedented scale. In many cases, the land itself is not suited to straight-line engineering, forcing workers to carve artificial paths that ignore natural geography entirely. The railway does not follow the world as it is. It forces the world to adjust to its design. Much of this labour is performed by large work gangs, often recruited from rural populations with limited alternatives. These workers, sometimes known historically as navvies, endure harsh conditions for long hours, digging, hauling stone, and constructing embankments under constant pressure to meet deadlines driven by investors and contractors. Injuries are common. Safety standards, where they exist at all, are minimal by modern expectations. The physical cost of building the railway is written into the terrain itself. One of the lesser discussed aspects of this period is how quickly financial speculation becomes intertwined with railway expansion. Building rail lines requires enormous capital, far beyond what individual engineers or small enterprises can provide. As a result, joint stock companies emerge, pooling investments from a wide range of social classes. For many investors, railways represent not just infrastructure, but opportunity. The expectation of future profit drives rapid expansion, sometimes ahead of practical demand. This speculative environment creates cycles of intense growth and sudden instability. Entire regions may see multiple competing proposals for rail routes, not all of which are completed. Some projects are abandoned mid-construction, when funding collapses or expectations shift. Others proceed at unsustainable speed, driven by optimism that does not always align with technical or economic reality. In this sense, the railway age is also an early example of large-scale infrastructure shaped by financial psychology as much as engineering necessity. At the same time, accidents and mechanical failures remind observers that this new system is still evolving. Early locomotives and rail lines do not yet benefit from the rigorous safety systems that will later define modern transport. Boiler explosions, derailments, and structural collapses occur with enough frequency to maintain public awareness of risk. Each incident becomes both a setback and a source of learning, gradually improving standards over time. The environmental impact of railway construction is also significant, though rarely understood in modern ecological terms at the time. Forests are cleared for timber and track placement, hills are excavated and reshaped, rivers are redirected or bridged in ways that alter local ecosystems. The landscape becomes a site of continuous modification, shaped by industrial priorities rather than natural evolution. This transformation is often seen as progress, even when it permanently alters local environments. Another important but often overlooked dimension is the effect on existing transport workers. Horse-drawn carriage operators, canal boat crews, and local freight carriers find their livelihoods increasingly threatened by the efficiency of rail transport. While some adapt by integrating into railway-related industries, others experience economic displacement. The transition is not uniform, and its consequences vary widely depending on region and occupation. Despite these disruptions, the advantages of rail transport continue to accumulate. Goods move faster, more reliably, and in far greater volume than before. Markets expand beyond local boundaries, and industries gain access to resources that were previously difficult or impossible to reach. This economic integration strengthens the appeal of railways even in the face of social and labour challenges. Engineering knowledge also advances rapidly during this period. Experience gained from early construction projects informs better practices in surveying, grading, and structural design. Engineers begin to develop more systematic approaches to route planning, considering not only distance but terrain resistance, fuel efficiency, and long-term maintenance. Railways become not just feats of construction, but exercises in large-scale optimization. One of the more subtle but transformative changes introduced by railways is the increasing importance of coordination across time and space. Construction projects must be synchronized across multiple sites. Supply chains must deliver materials in precise sequences, and train operations must be carefully scheduled to avoid congestion. This growing dependence on coordination lays the groundwork for modern logistical thinking, where timing is as important as physical distance. As rail networks expand, they also begin to influence political and strategic considerations. Governments and industrial leaders recognize that control of transport infrastructure translates into economic and military advantage. Rail lines become tools of influence, shaping regional development patterns and, in some cases, determining which cities grow and which decline. Infrastructure is no longer neutral. It becomes a form of power. Yet despite all these challenges and complexities, the momentum of railway expansion does not slow. Each obstacle leads to refinement. Each failure produces improved methods. Each success reinforces the system's value. Over time, the railway transitions from a risky experiment into a foundational element of industrial society. By the end of this phase, the iron network is no longer just connecting industrial centres. It is actively reshaping labour systems, financial structures, landscapes, and social expectations. The cost of building this system is immense, but so too is its impact. What emerges from this period is not only a new mode of transport, but a new way of organising human activity across space. The railway has become more than technology. It is now infrastructure in the deepest sense, binding together economies, cities, and regions into a more interconnected whole, while leaving behind a complex legacy of disruption, adaptation, and transformation. Beyond Britain's industrial heartlands, where the first rail networks have already begun to reshape the rhythm of movement and labour, a wider transformation is quietly unfolding across continents. Iron rails, once confined to experimental corridors and mining routes, begin to spread outward like a new kind of geography, one not formed by rivers or mountain ranges, but by engineering decisions, capital investment, and the demands of accelerating industrial economies. The railway is no longer a British phenomenon, it's becoming a global one. In continental Europe, early adoption of rail technology follows closely behind Britain, though with regional differences in speed and strategy. Nations with strong centralised governments and growing industrial bases begin to recognise the strategic importance of rail infrastructure in France, Prussia, and parts of the Austro-Hungarian territories. Rail lines are constructed not only to support trade, but also to strengthen internal cohesion across diverse and sometimes geographically fragmented regions. The railway becomes a tool of unification as much as transportation. Unlike Britain, where early development is heavily driven by private enterprise and competition among companies, Many European rail systems evolve with greater state involvement. Governments often play a direct role in planning routes, financing construction, and standardizing operations. This results in a more coordinated expansion in some regions, though it also introduces political considerations into what was initially a purely industrial technology. Rail lines are designed not only for economic efficiency, but also for administrative control and strategic mobility. As rail networks extend across Europe, they begin to reshape trade patterns that had remained relatively stable for centuries. Goods that once moved slowly along river systems or overland caravan routes now travel rapidly between major urban centres. Markets become more interconnected, and regional specialisation intensifies. Cities that gain rail access experience accelerated growth, while those bypassed by major lines often struggle to maintain their economic relevance. At the same time, the technology begins to cross oceans. In North America, railways arrive in a landscape that is both vast and sparsely connected compared to Europe. Here, the railway is not just an improvement to existing infrastructure, but a foundational tool for continental development. The challenge is not replacing older systems, but creating connectivity where little existed before on a large scale. Early American rail projects face enormous geographic obstacles: dense forests, wide river systems, mountain ranges, and vast plains that stretch beyond immediate economic centres. Yet these very challenges make rail transport essential. Without it, large-scale settlement, resource extraction, and national integration would be extremely difficult. Railways become the backbone of expansion, linking coastal cities with inland territories and enabling the movement of people and goods across previously unmanageable distances. One of the most significant consequences of railway expansion in North America is the acceleration of settlement patterns. Towns emerge along rail lines, often at predictable intervals determined by fuel needs, water access, or logistical planning. Some of these settlements grow into major cities, while others remain small but strategically important stops. The map of human habitation begins to align with railway geography, rather than natural features alone. In colonial territories across Asia, Africa, and other regions under European influence, railways take on an additional layer of meaning. They are not only tools of economic development, but also instruments of administrative control and resource extraction. Rail lines connect inland resource regions to coastal ports, facilitating the export of raw materials and the import of manufactured goods. This creates new patterns of dependency and integration into global trade systems. A less visible but crucial aspect of global railway expansion is the standardization of technology. As rail systems spread across different countries and continents, the need for compatibility becomes increasingly important. Track gauges, signalling methods, and locomotive designs begin to converge toward common standards, though not without regional variation. This gradual harmonization allows rail networks to become more interoperable and efficient over time. At the same time, railways begin to influence cultural perceptions of distance and time on a global scale. Journeys that once required weeks or months by traditional transport methods are reduced to days or even hours. The psychological impact of this compression of space is profound. Regions that once felt distant and disconnected begin to feel part of a more integrated world system, even if political and cultural differences remain significant. Engineering challenges continue to shape expansion in different environments. In mountainous regions, tunnels and bridges require increasingly sophisticated design techniques. In desert areas, rails must withstand extreme temperature fluctuations. In tropical climates, vegetation and moisture present constant maintenance challenges. Each environment forces adaptation, contributing to a growing body of engineering knowledge that is shared and refined across international networks. Financially, railway expansion becomes one of the largest capital investments in human history up to that point. Governments, private investors, and international financiers all participate in funding construction. The scale of investment reflects not only confidence in the technology but also dependence on it. Entire national economies begin to rely on the assumption of continued railway expansion and operation. Despite its benefits, global railway expansion is not without controversy. In some regions, construction disrupts local communities, alters traditional land use, and intensifies economic inequalities. The benefits of connectivity are often unevenly distributed, favouring industrial centres and export-oriented regions over rural or less accessible areas. The railway, while unifying in some respects, also reinforces new forms of economic and spatial imbalance. Still, the overall trajectory remains clear. Rail transport is rapidly becoming the dominant mode of long-distance land travel in industrialising regions. Its combination of speed, capacity, and reliability makes it difficult for older systems to compete. Roads and canals continue to exist, but increasingly in supporting roles rather than as primary transport networks. By the end of this global expansion phase, the railway has transformed from a localised industrial innovation into a worldwide system of movement and exchange. It links continents, reshapes economies, and alters the very structure of global interaction. The world is no longer just connected by sea routes and overland paths, but by a growing web of iron lines that define a new era of mobility. The age of isolated transport systems is ending. In its place, a new integrated geography is emerging, one where distance is no longer absolute, but relative to the speed and reach of engineered networks. Across the vast interior landscapes of continents, where rivers bend slowly through plains and mountains stand like ancient barriers carved by time, a new ambition begins to take shape, the idea that entire nations can be stitched together, not just by political borders or waterways, but by continuous iron pathways that cut through the very resistance of geography itself. The railway is no longer simply expanding outward, it is now attempting to unify entire land masses. The concept of a transcontinental railway emerges from a combination of economic necessity, political vision, and technological confidence. In regions where populations are separated by immense distances, traditional transport systems prove insufficient for large-scale integration. Coastal cities may thrive independently, but the interior remains disconnected, slow to develop, and difficult to govern effectively. Railways offer a solution that is both practical and transformative, a direct physical link between distant economic zones. In North America, this idea becomes especially powerful. The continent's vast scale presents both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, it contains immense natural resources, timber, minerals, agricultural land that are difficult to access without reliable transport. On the other hand, the distances involved make traditional travel and freight movements slow and inefficient. The railway becomes the only realistic mechanism for turning geographic vastness into economic advantage. The construction of early transcontinental lines is an undertaking of extraordinary complexity. Surveyors must chart routes across mountains, deserts, rivers, and plains, often in conditions that are remote and physically demanding. Engineers must design solutions for elevation changes that require tunnels through solid rock and bridges spanning deep valleys. Every segment of track represents a negotiation between human intention and natural resistance. One of the most significant challenges in this process is not purely technical, but logistical. Supplying construction crews working in remote regions requires its own transport systems, often relying on temporary roads, river routes, or earlier rail segments that are still under construction. In this sense, the railway builds itself in stages, each completed section becoming the foundation for the next. Labour during these projects is diverse and often multinational. Workers from different regions, sometimes from entirely different continents, contribute to construction efforts. This creates complex social environments along the construction zones, where cultural differences, language barriers, and working conditions intersect under high pressure and strict timelines. The human scale of the project is as vast as the geography it attempts to traverse. As rails extend westward across open plains, a different kind of challenge emerges. Unlike mountainous regions where terrain is physically obstructive, plains present the difficulty of scale and exposure. Long stretches of track must be laid with precise alignment across hundreds of kilometres with minimal natural reference points. Weather conditions, heat, wind, storms become significant factors affecting both construction and maintenance. At the same time, railways begin to transform the landscapes they pass through. New settlements appear at regular intervals, often initially as supply stations or maintenance points. Over time, many of these evolve into towns and cities. The railway does not simply connect existing places, it actively generates new ones. Human geography begins to reorganize itself around these lines of iron. Economically, the completion of transcontinental railways marks a shift in how national markets operate. Goods can now move from interior production zones to coastal export points in days rather than weeks. Agricultural regions gain access to distant urban markets, while industrial centres gain access to raw materials on an unprecedented scale. This integration accelerates economic growth and deepens interdependence between regions that were previously only loosely connected. Yet this expansion also introduces new tensions. Indigenous populations in various regions are displaced or disrupted as rail lines cut through traditional territories. Environmental changes occur as construction alters water systems, animal migration routes, and land use patterns. The railway, while a symbol of progress in industrial terms, carries complex consequences that are unevenly experienced across different communities. Technological innovation continues alongside expansion. Locomotives become more powerful to handle longer routes and heavier loads. Fuel efficiency improves, and braking systems become more reliable to manage high-speed travel across long distances. Track engineering also advances, with improved materials and structural designs allowing for greater durability under continuous use. One of the most important but subtle developments during this period is the increasing predictability of long-distance transport. Before railways, long journeys were uncertain, subject to weather, terrain, and resource availability. With transcontinental rail systems, schedules become more reliable and economic planning becomes more precise. This reliability changes how governments, businesses, and individuals think about time and distance. The symbolic impact of these projects is also significant. Completing a rail line across an entire continent is often seen as a demonstration of national capability and technological maturity. It represents not just engineering success, but the ability to organise labour, capital, and knowledge on a massive coordinated scale. However, the completion of these systems does not mark the end of development. Instead, it opens new phases of expansion and refinement. Secondary lines branch off from main routes, connecting smaller towns and resource regions. Networks become denser, more interconnected, and increasingly complex. The railway ceases to be a single line or set of lines and becomes an integrated system. By the end of this phase, the idea of continental distance has fundamentally changed. What once required months of travel can now be traversed in a matter of days. Entire regions that were once isolated are now part of a unified transport system. The railway has effectively compressed geography at a scale previously unimaginable. Yet even as this transformation unfolds, the system remains in motion, expansion continues, new routes are planned, New technologies are tested, the railway. Once an experiment in industrial mobility, has become a defining structure of modern civilization, shaping not only how people move, but how entire societies organise themselves across space. Beyond the straight lines drawn across plains and the engineered cuts through hills, the railway begins to confront something far less cooperative than labour or capital, the natural structure of the earth itself. Mountains rise without regard for schedules, rivers shift unpredictably with seasons, and deserts stretch across hundreds of kilometres without reliable water or stable ground. If railways are to continue expanding, they must learn not just to move across landscapes, but to pass through them, over them, and sometimes beneath them. This phase of railway development is defined by engineering confrontation with terrain at its most extreme. Early rail lines could avoid difficult geography by following valleys or coastal routes, but as networks expand and demand for direct connections increases, avoidance is no longer sufficient. Efficiency requires straightness requires intervention, and intervention requires new levels of engineering ambition. Mountains present one of the most complex challenges. Unlike flat terrain, where grading and alignment are manageable, mountainous regions require either long detours or direct penetration through solid rock. Early solutions involve switchbacks and gradual ascents, but these methods significantly reduce speed and efficiency. As locomotives become more powerful, engineers begin to attempt tunnels cutting directly through geological barriers that once defined natural boundaries. Tunnel construction in this era is slow, dangerous, and highly dependent on manual labour. Workers drill into rock using hand tools and early explosives, often working in confined, poorly ventilated conditions. The risk of collapse, gas accumulation, and miscalculation is constant. Yet despite these dangers, tunnels become essential to maintaining the continuity of rail networks across difficult terrain. Each completed tunnel represents not just a technical achievement, but a redefinition of what is geographically possible. Bridges introduce another layer of complexity. Rivers that once dictated the placement of settlements and trade routes must now be crossed in ways that support heavy, fast-moving locomotives. Early bridge designs, often adapted from existing architectural principles, are gradually replaced by more specialised iron and steel structures capable of bearing dynamic loads. These bridges do not merely span gaps. They redistribute forces across engineered frameworks designed for constant vibration and stress. Desert environments introduce a different kind of challenge. Here, the problem is not elevation or water, but absence of stability. Sand shifts under weight, temperature extremes affect metal expansion, and long distances without resources complicate maintenance. Rail lines in these regions require constant monitoring and reinforcement. The environment does not resist with force, but with instability. In tropical regions, vegetation and moisture become persistent obstacles. Rapid plant growth can obstruct tracks, while humidity accelerates material degradation. Maintenance becomes continuous rather than periodic, requiring dedicated infrastructure just to keep rail lines operational. In these environments, the railway is not just built once, it must be constantly sustained against natural regeneration. As engineers confront these diverse conditions, railway design becomes increasingly specialised. Standard track layouts are adapted to local environments. Materials are improved to resist corrosion, wear, and temperature variation. Locomotives are modified for altitude, climate, and load distribution. What was once a relatively uniform technology begins to diversify into region-specific systems sharing a common foundation. One of the most important but often underappreciated developments during this period is the emergence of geological understanding as a practical engineering tool. Surveying becomes more precise, incorporating knowledge of rock formations, soil stability, and hydrological behaviour. Railway construction is no longer just mechanical work, it is an applied science of landscape interaction. At the same time, the increasing complexity of railway systems leads to new forms of coordination. Construction projects spanning difficult terrain require synchronised efforts across multiple teams, sometimes separated by vast distances. Communication systems begin to evolve in parallel, ensuring that materials, labour and progress remain aligned. The railway begins to depend not only on physical infrastructure, but on informational infrastructure as well. Despite these advances, failure remains a constant possibility. Landslides can destroy carefully constructed tracks, floods can undermine foundations, structural fatigue can accumulate over time, leading to unexpected breakdowns. Each environment introduces its own set of risks, and no engineering solution eliminates uncertainty entirely. The railway expands not through perfection, but through continuous adaptation. Economically, the ability to traverse difficult terrain has significant consequences. Regions once considered inaccessible are brought into economic networks. Mineral deposits in remote mountains, agricultural zones in isolated valleys, and resources in arid interiors become viable sources of industrial supply. Geography, once a limiting factor, becomes an engineered variable. Yet this transformation also raises questions about scale and sustainability. As rail networks extend into increasingly remote and fragile environments, the cost of construction and maintenance rises. Some routes prove economically viable, while others require long-term investment that may not yield immediate returns. The balance between ambition and practicality becomes a central concern for planners and engineers. By the end of this phase, railways are no longer confined to favourable terrain. They have become systems capable of traversing nearly any environment on Earth, provided sufficient resources and engineering effort are applied. Mountains, rivers, deserts, and forests no longer represent absolute barriers, but challenges to be solved through design and persistence. The railway has thus evolved from a simple transport innovation into a comprehensive system for reshaping the relationship between human movement and natural geography. It does not eliminate the influence of the environment, but it increasingly negotiates with it, bending natural constraints into engineered pathways. In this expanded form, the railway becomes not just a network of lines, but a continuous interaction between technology and terrain, where every kilometre represents both a physical achievement and a redefinition of what movement across the Earth can mean. As railways spread across continents and begin to penetrate even the most resistant landscapes, their influence starts to extend far beyond transportation itself. What was once a system for moving goods and people begins to reshape the deeper structure of industrial civilization, altering how production is organised, how resources are distributed, and how entire economies function at scale. The railway ceases to be just a network of movement and becomes a framework for industrial power. In the early phases of industrialisation, production was often localised. Factories depended heavily on nearby resources, whether coal, water, or raw materials, and distribution was limited by the speed of land or water transport. This created a fragmented economic landscape, where regions developed relatively independently based on local conditions. Railways disrupt this pattern by decoupling production from proximity. Factories no longer need to be close to resources if rail transport can reliably bridge the distance between them. This shift leads to a profound reorganisation of industrial geography. Resource extraction becomes concentrated in regions where deposits are richest and easiest to access, while manufacturing centres grow in areas with skilled labour and existing infrastructure. Railways connect these specialised zones into integrated systems, allowing materials to flow continuously between them. The result is an early form of networked industrial economy, where efficiency depends not on local self-sufficiency, but on coordinated interdependence. One of the less visible but deeply important consequences of this transformation is the acceleration of production cycles. Before railways, delays in transport often forced factories to maintain large inventories of raw materials and finished goods. With reliable rail schedules, these buffers can be reduced, materials arrive more predictably, and goods can be shipped with greater precision. This reduces waste, lowers storage costs, and increases overall productivity. At the same time, railways enable a scale of production that was previously impossible. Factories can expand output without being constrained by immediate local supply chains. Coal from distant mines, iron from remote regions, and agricultural products from far-flung areas can all be integrated into centralised production systems. This leads to the rise of large industrial complexes that depend entirely on rail connectivity for their operation. The impact on labour systems is equally significant. Workers are no longer confined to living near sources of raw materials or small local workshops. Rail transport allows for greater mobility, enabling populations to shift toward industrial centres. This contributes to rapid urbanisation, as cities grow around railway hubs and industrial zones. The movement of labour becomes as important as the movement of goods. Railways also begin to influence the organisation of time within industry. Production schedules increasingly align with train timetables. Factories adjust shift patterns to match the arrival of raw materials and the departure of finished goods. This synchronisation creates a more tightly coordinated industrial rhythm, where delays in one part of the system can affect multiple others. Time becomes an operational resource, not just a natural constant. Another important development is the emergence of logistics as a distinct field of knowledge and practice. Coordinating the movement of materials across expanding rail networks requires planning at a scale previously unnecessary. Routes must be optimised, schedules balanced, and resources allocated efficiently across competing demands. This gives rise to early forms of supply chain management, where the focus is not just on production, but on the entire flow of materials from source to destination. The railway's influence on industrial power is not limited to economics. It also has strategic implications. Nations with extensive rail networks gain significant advantages in mobilising resources, transporting goods, and responding to crises. Railways enable rapid movement of military supplies and personnel, fundamentally altering the logistics of defence and expansion. Control over rail infrastructure becomes a form of strategic control over territory itself. In this way, railways begin to function as both economic and political instruments. They determine which regions develop rapidly and which remain peripheral. They influence trade routes, settlement patterns, and even administrative boundaries. The structure of modern states begins to align more closely with the structure of their rail networks. Despite these advantages, the system also introduces new vulnerabilities, because industries become dependent on continuous flows of materials. Disruptions in rail transport can have widespread effects. A blocked line, damaged bridge, or delayed shipment can ripple through entire production systems. Interdependence increases efficiency, but it also increases sensitivity to failure. Technological innovation continues to respond to these challenges. Signalling systems improve to prevent collisions and manage traffic density. Scheduling becomes more precise, and communication between stations becomes more immediate. Locomotives are refined for reliability and endurance, capable of operating under heavier loads and longer distances without breakdown. By this stage, railways are no longer just supporting industry, they are actively shaping its evolution. The scale, location, and organisation of production are all influenced by the structure of rail networks. industrial civilization begins to reorganize itself around the assumption that fast, reliable land transport is always available. What emerges is a deeply interconnected system in which railways serve as the circulatory network of industrial society. Materials, energy, labour, and finished goods all move through this system in coordinated flows. The efficiency of the entire structure depends on the stability of its rail connections. By the end of this phase, the railway is no longer an external support for industry. It has become one of its fundamental organising principles, embedded in the logic of production, distribution, and economic growth. Industrial power and railway infrastructure become inseparable, each reinforcing the other in a continuous cycle of expansion. The world is now not just industrialised, but rail-organised, with movement itself forming the backbone of economic life. As rail networks mature and industrial systems stabilise around them, a quieter transformation begins to unfold not in factories or mines, but in the way ordinary people experience movement itself. What was once purely functional transport gradually acquires layers of comfort, design, and cultural meaning. The railway, originally born from necessity and industrial pressure, begins to evolve into something that also carries imagination. Early passenger travel by rail is basic, often uncomfortable, and still closely tied to freight systems. Carriages are adapted from cargo designs, offering little protection from weather or noise. Yet even in these primitive conditions, something remarkable becomes clear. Speed changes perception. Journeys that once felt like significant physical undertakings begin to feel shorter, more predictable, and less physically exhausting. This shift alone begins to redefine how people think about distance and travel. As rail companies expand and competition increases, attention gradually turns toward improving the passenger experience. Covered carriages become more common, seating arrangements are refined, and separation between classes of travel begins to emerge. What was once a purely utilitarian system starts to reflect social structure more visibly. The railway becomes not just a means of movement, but a mirror of society itself. One of the most symbolic developments in this period is the introduction of specialised passenger services. Dining cars, sleeping compartments, and more comfortable seating arrangements transform long-distance travel into something that can be endured with relative ease. For the first time, it becomes possible to travel across large regions without significant physical strain or disruption to daily life. Movement begins to blend with living rather than interrupt it. This change has subtle but far-reaching consequences. Travel is no longer reserved only for merchants, officials, or those undertaking necessary journeys. Increasingly, it becomes accessible to broader segments of society. Families can visit distant relatives more easily. Individuals can relocate for work or opportunity with far less uncertainty. The railway begins to reshape not only economies, but personal lives. At the same time, train stations evolve into architectural and cultural landmarks. They are no longer just functional points of departure and arrival, but symbolic gateways between regions, cities, and experiences. Large central stations in major cities become bustling hubs of activity, filled with movement, commerce, and anticipation. The station becomes a new kind of urban space, transitional, dynamic, and constantly in motion. Rail travel also begins to influence culture and perception. The experience of moving rapidly through landscapes creates a new way of seeing the world. Instead of slowly traversing terrain, passengers now observe it in motion, as shifting sequences of fields, forests, rivers, and towns. The landscape becomes something that passes rather than something that is laboriously crossed. This changes not only travel, but the psychology of observation itself. Luxury rail services emerge as a distinct expression of technological prestige. Wealthier passengers gain access to refined interiors, carefully designed meals, and smoother travel experiences. These services transform trains into symbols of modern sophistication and national achievement. Travelling by rail becomes not just practical, but aspirational in certain contexts. Behind this growing emphasis on comfort, however, the industrial foundation remains essential. Freight transport continues to dominate railway usage in terms of volume and economic importance. The same systems that carry passengers in comfort are also responsible for moving coal, iron, grain, and manufactured goods that sustain entire economies. Passenger experience is layered on top of an infrastructure primarily designed for industrial efficiency. As rail networks expand further, long-distance travel becomes increasingly normalised. Journeys that once required careful planning and significant hardship can now be undertaken with relative predictability. This encourages not only mobility, but also cultural exchange. Ideas, customs, and social influences begin to move more rapidly between regions connected by rail. An important but often overlooked effect of this increased mobility is the gradual weakening of regional isolation. Dialects, traditions, and local practices are no longer confined to specific geographic zones. While they do not disappear, they begin to interact more frequently with outside influences. The railway becomes a channel not just for goods and people, but for cultural blending. Technological improvements continue in parallel with these social changes. Track quality improves, reducing vibration and increasing stability at higher speeds. Locomotives become quieter, more efficient, and more reliable over long distances. Safety systems are refined to reduce accidents and improve coordination across increasingly dense networks. Despite these advancements, early railway travel still carries a sense of unpredictability compared to modern standards. Weather conditions, mechanical strain, and operational complexity all introduce variability into journeys. Yet even with these imperfections, the overall experience remains transformative compared to pre-rail travel systems. By the end of this phase, railways have developed a dual identity. On one hand, they remain the backbone of industrial logistics, essential for the movement of raw materials and goods. On the other hand, they have become a central feature of human mobility, shaping how people experience distance, time, and landscape. This dual role reinforces the railway's importance in modern civilization. It is not confined to one function or one class of user. It operates simultaneously as infrastructure, industry, and experience. Its presence is both practical and symbolic, deeply embedded in the structure of daily life. The world shaped by railways is no longer defined solely by production and geography, but by movement itself controlled, scheduled, and increasingly woven into the fabric of how societies function and how individuals live. By the time railways have become the dominant framework of land-based movement across industrial nations, their role begins to shift in ways that go beyond economics or daily travel. The same networks that once carried coal, iron, and passengers across expanding continents now reveal a far more strategic dimension. Movement, once a matter of convenience and efficiency, becomes a matter of control, timing, and power. In periods of conflict, the railway transforms into one of the most decisive tools available to modern states. Armies that once depended on slow marches, uncertain supply lines, and seasonal limitations now gain the ability to mobilize at unprecedented speed. Entire divisions can be transported across hundreds of kilometers in a fraction of the time previously required. The rhythm of warfare begins to synchronize with the rhythm of rail schedules. This shift does not occur suddenly, but through gradual recognition of the railway's strategic value. Military planners begin to understand that victory is no longer determined solely by battlefield tactics, but by logistics, the ability to move troops, equipment, and supplies efficiently across vast distances. Railways become the hidden backbone of military readiness, often more important than individual weapon systems. One of the most significant changes introduced by rail-based warfare is the compression of mobilization time. In earlier eras, assembling large armies could take weeks or months, depending on geography and infrastructure. With rail networks, this process is dramatically accelerated. Troops can be gathered, supplied, and deployed with a level of coordination that was previously impossible. This alters not only the speed of warfare, but its very structure. Rail infrastructure itself becomes a strategic target. Bridges, junctions, and stations gain importance not just as transport nodes, but as critical points of vulnerability. Disruption of a single rail line can affect entire supply chains, forcing armies or industries to reroute movement or pause operations. The railway system, once designed for efficiency, becomes a network whose integrity directly influences national stability. At the same time, railways enable new forms of industrial-scale warfare support. Factories located deep within a nation's interior can supply frontline operations with continuous streams of materials, weapons, and provisions. This separation between production zones and conflict zones is made possible only through reliable rail transport. Without it, sustained large-scale conflict would be far more difficult to maintain. The impact of railways on strategic geography is profound. Regions with dense rail networks gain significant advantages in mobilization and supply. Strategic planning begins to incorporate rail access as a fundamental factor in both defense and expansion. The layout of rail lines becomes, in effect, a map of potential movement and vulnerability. Beyond military applications, railways also begin to influence administrative control. Governments use rail networks to maintain communication with distant regions, deploy resources, and enforce coordination across large territories. The ability to move personnel and information quickly strengthens central authority, reducing the effective isolation of remote areas. However, this concentration of control also introduces new dependencies. As societies become more reliant on rail systems for both civilian and strategic functions, disruptions can have cascading effects. A damaged bridge, a blocked junction, or a delayed shipment can ripple across military, economic, and administrative systems simultaneously. The efficiency of rail networks comes with a corresponding increase in systemic sensitivity. During major conflicts, the scale of railway usage expands dramatically. Entire logistical systems are reorganized around rail corridors. Temporary expansions, new lines, and rapid repairs become common as demand exceeds peacetime capacity. Railways are pushed beyond their original design limits, revealing both their flexibility and their structural constraints. At the technological level, warfare accelerates innovation in rail systems. Stronger locomotives, more durable tracks, and improved signaling systems are developed to handle increased traffic and heavier loads. Communication technologies begin to integrate with rail operations, enabling more precise coordination and reducing the risk of congestion or collision in high-density networks. Despite their strategic importance, railways are not immune to the uncertainties of conflict. Lines can be damaged or destroyed, requiring rapid repair under difficult conditions. Supply disruptions can create bottlenecks that affect entire regions. In this sense, railways are both instruments of power and potential points of fragility. Outside of wartime contexts, the influence of railways on governance and state organization continues to grow. The ability to move resources and personnel efficiently across territory strengthens administrative cohesion. Governments can respond more quickly to regional needs, enforce regulations more consistently, and maintain stronger connections between central and peripheral regions. Yet this same connectivity also reduces isolation. making regions more interdependent and less self-sufficient. Economic and political stability becomes increasingly tied to the reliability of rail infrastructure. The railway system, once a tool of industrial expansion, becomes a foundational element of state function. By the end of this phase, railways have fully established themselves as dual-purpose systems essential for both civilian life and strategic capability. They are no longer merely transport networks, but integrated systems of movement, coordination, and power distribution. What began as an innovation in industrial mobility has evolved into a defining structure of modern organisation. The speed of movement now directly influences the speed of response, production, and control. In this way, railways shape not only how societies move, but how they operate at the highest levels of structure and decision-making. The age of rail is no longer just an age of industry or travel. It is an age in which movement itself becomes a central component of power. As the railway system reaches its full maturity across industrialised nations, a new force begins to challenge its dominance from multiple directions. The world that railways helped create fast-moving, interconnected, and industrially dense now gives rise to competing technologies that begin to reshape the meaning of distance once again. Roads improve dramatically with the rise of automobiles. Air travel emerges as a radically faster method of crossing long distances. Highways expand in ways that prioritise flexibility over fixed routes. The railway, once the undisputed backbone of movement, now finds itself in a more complex and competitive landscape. This shift does not happen overnight. For a long time, railways remain unmatched in their ability to move large volumes of goods efficiently across land. Heavy industry continues to rely on them. Cities remain structured around rail hubs. Freight networks still depend heavily on iron lines that connect mines, factories, and ports. But gradually, the balance begins to change in passenger travel, where flexibility and point-to-point mobility become increasingly important. One of the key limitations that begins to define rail transport in this new era is its fixed infrastructure. Railways require tracks, stations, and carefully maintained routes. They are highly efficient within their established networks but less adaptable outside them. In contrast, automobiles offer decentralised movement. Roads can reach far more locations, and vehicles can deviate from fixed paths. This flexibility slowly erodes the railway's dominance in personal transportation. Air travel introduces an even more dramatic transformation. By bypassing the constraints of terrain entirely, aircraft reduce travel times across continents and oceans to a fraction of what rail systems can achieve. While early aviation is limited in capacity and accessibility, its symbolic impact is profound. For the first time since the rise of railways, a fundamentally different model of long-distance movement emerges, one that does not rely on ground-based infrastructure at all. Despite these challenges, railways do not disappear or decline uniformly. Instead, they begin to specialise. In many regions, rail systems shift focus toward freight transport, where their efficiency at moving large volumes over long distances remains unmatched. Bulk goods such as coal, grain, steel, and industrial materials continue to flow through rail networks in ways that alternative systems cannot easily replicate. Urban commuter rail systems also evolve in response to growing cities. As metropolitan areas expand outward, railways adapt to serve dense populations moving between residential zones and economic centres. Suburban rail lines, metro systems, and regional networks become essential components of urban life, even as long-distance passenger dominance declines in some regions. This period is also marked by a wave of modernisation efforts. Rail infrastructure is upgraded to accommodate higher speeds, greater efficiency, and improved safety standards. Electrification begins to replace older steam-based systems in many areas, reducing reliance on coal and increasing operational consistency. Signalling systems become more advanced, allowing for dense traffic and better coordination across complex networks. Yet modernisation is not uniform across all regions. Some rail systems are heavily upgraded and integrated into modern transport strategies, while others struggle with ageing infrastructure and underinvestment. This creates a global landscape in which railways vary widely in capability and relevance depending on local economic and political conditions. One of the more subtle but important transformations of this era is the change in how railways are perceived culturally. In earlier periods, trains symbolised cutting-edge technology, speed, and industrial progress. They represented the future. In the modern era, that symbolism becomes more nuanced. Railways are still respected for their efficiency and reliability, but they are no longer always seen as the newest expression of technological advancement. Instead, they take on a dual identity, both historical infrastructure and modern utility. In some contexts, they are associated with tradition and legacy. In others, they remain essential components of contemporary transport systems. This layered identity reflects the long historical arc of railway development, from experimental wagonways to global networks. Economically, railways continue to play a critical role in global supply chains, even as other transport modes expand. The efficiency of rail freight ensures its continued relevance in industries where scale and cost-effectiveness are more important than speed or flexibility. In many cases, rail transport integrates with road and sea systems, forming multimodal logistics networks that define modern global trade. The competition between transport systems does not eliminate railways. Instead, it redistributes their function. Rail becomes one component within a larger ecosystem of movement technologies, each optimized for different scales and types of travel. This integration reflects a broader trend in technological evolution, where older systems are not fully replaced but repositioned within more complex structures. By the end of this phase, the railway has transitioned from dominance to specialisation. It is no longer the singular solution to land transport, but it remains deeply embedded in the functioning of modern economies and cities. Its role has shifted from universal infrastructure to a central backbone within a diversified transport system. The legacy of railways is no longer defined only by expansion, but by adaptation. They continue to evolve, not as the sole drivers of movement, but as enduring components of a world where speed, flexibility, and connectivity are shared across multiple technological systems. What remains constant is their foundational influence, the reshaping of how humanity understands distance, time, and the movement of people and goods across the surface of the Earth. Even as newer technologies reshape how people move across land, air, and water, the railway does not fade into obscurity. Instead, it settles into something more enduring, less visible in everyday imagination but deeply embedded in the structure of modern life. Its tracks, once symbols of radical transformation, now form quiet but essential corridors beneath the constant motion of contemporary civilization. In many places, they are so familiar that they are no longer noticed. Yet entire systems continue to depend on them. In modern cities, railways persist most clearly in the movement of people within dense urban environments. Suburban lines bring commuters into metropolitan centres each morning and return them at night in steady, predictable flows. Underground systems carry millions through tunnels carved beneath streets, invisible to the chaos above. These networks are no longer experimental or extraordinary. They are routine, yet indispensable. Freight rail, meanwhile, continues to operate on a scale that is often hidden from daily awareness. Long trains carry raw materials across continents, linking ports, factories, and distribution hubs in a continuous cycle of industrial movement. Even as trucks and airplanes handle portions of global logistics, rail remains one of the most efficient systems for heavy, long-distance transport. Its value is measured not in visibility, but in capacity and consistency. What is striking about the railway in its modern form is how fully it has integrated into the background structure of civilization. Roads, digital networks, shipping routes, and aviation systems all coexist with rail, forming a layered global infrastructure. Each serves a different function, yet rail continues to occupy a central position in the movement of bulk goods and urban populations. It is no longer the singular revolution it once was, but it remains one of the foundations upon which modern mobility rests. Technologically, rail systems continue to evolve, though often in incremental rather than revolutionary ways. High-speed trains compress distance once again, echoing the original shock that early locomotives created centuries earlier. Electrification, automation, and advanced signalling systems improve safety, efficiency, and environmental performance. In some regions, railways are being reimagined as sustainable alternatives to more energy-intensive forms of transport, giving them renewed relevance in a changing world. Yet the deeper legacy of railways is not only technical, it lies in how they permanently altered the human relationship with space. Before rail, distance was experienced as effort, uncertainty, and time. After rail, distance became something that could be scheduled, measured, and reliably traversed. This shift did not end with the rise of automobiles or airplanes. It began with railways and remains embedded in how modern societies think about movement itself. Entire cities still reflect this legacy. Urban layouts expand outward from rail hubs. Economic activity clusters around transport nodes. Regional development often follows the invisible logic of historical rail lines, even when newer systems overlay them. The railway's influence persists not only in infrastructure, but in the underlying structure of spatial organisation. There is also a quieter, more reflective dimension to the railway's legacy. In many places, older lines remain in use alongside modern systems, carrying echoes of earlier industrial eras. Abandoned stations, repurposed tracks, and preserved locomotives serve as reminders of a time when rail represented the cutting edge of technological possibility. These remnants do not simply mark the past, they illustrate how deeply railways became woven into the fabric of modern history. At a global scale, the railway story is one of transformation without disappearance. Few technologies have undergone such a complete evolution in role, while remaining continuously relevant. From mining wagonways to high-speed intercity networks, from industrial freight corridors to urban commuter systems, rail has adapted across centuries without losing its fundamental identity as a system for guided movement. What makes this continuity remarkable is that the core principle has never changed. The wheel on the track remains at the heart of the system. The relationship between guided motion and engineered path still defines its efficiency. Even as materials, speeds, and control systems evolve, the basic logic of rail transport remains intact, a testament to the durability of its original design concept. Looking across this long arc of development, the railway appears less as a single invention, and more as a continuous unfolding of an idea that movement can be controlled, optimized, and scaled beyond the limitations of muscle, terrain, and individual effort. That idea reshaped economies, cities, warfare, and daily life in ways that continue to define the modern world. And yet, despite all its scale and impact, the railway often recedes into the background of attention. It does not demand constant recognition. It functions through reliability, repetition, and integration. Its presence is measured in the steady rhythm of arrivals and departures, in the movement of goods across unseen networks, in the quiet continuity of systems that rarely fail but are always in motion. In the end, The history of railways is not just the story of machines or tracks. It is the story of how humanity learned to compress distance, coordinate movement, and reorganize the world around engineered pathways. It is a story that began with simple wooden wagonways in dark mines and expanded into a global system that still shapes civilization today. Even now, long after newer technologies have taken the spotlight, the railway remains beneath it all steady, persistent, and foundational, carrying forward the same principle that first set iron wheels into motion.